The helicopter's shadow skimmed across the rooftops as it banked low toward the skeleton of a high-rise. Inside, the dim red light washed over Staff Sergeant Claire Donovan's face. She kept her gaze forward, not on the city's jagged horizon, but on the mental checklist she had been rehearsing since Wheels Up. Corporal Rachel Vega sat opposite, chin lowered toward her cracked spotting scope as if guarding it from the shifting rotor wash. The scope was a small thing to carry a flaw, but the thin fracture in its glass had followed them from the last rotation, a reminder that nothing stayed perfect in their line of work. The rotors wound down the moment their boots hit the roof. The air was cold in that pre-dawn way that smelled of dust more than anything else. Claire swept her eyes over the roof's broken edges, where rebar jutted like exposed bone. Glass crunched beneath her steps as she led the way toward a narrow stairwell. The building had long since surrendered to the war around it. Rust streaked the walls, and every surface held a thin film of grit. 2 blocks away, through gaps in the skyline, the CIA compound huddled behind its own wall of shadows. Somewhere inside, the recovery team was already in motion, preparing to pull hostages out before the city woke fully. They took position in what had once been a corner office. The windows were gone, replaced by jagged frames and the occasional dangling shard. Rachel unfolded the tripod with practiced care, sliding the legs until they found a stable hold on the uneven floor. Claire laid her rifle along the edge of the wall, aligning the barrel with the sector they'd been assigned. She unfolded her range card, its edges softened from handling but still marked with clean lines and neat figures. A light breeze pulled at the paper, carrying with it the faint sound of a motor somewhere in the streets below. Claire leaned in behind her scope, adjusting for elevation and checking wind flags on a rooftop downrange. The air currents here were fickle, shifting as they moved between broken structures, and she tracked each sway carefully. Through the glass, she saw shadowed movement in the compound, 2 figures crossing from one building to another, a third pausing at a doorway before disappearing inside. Occasionally, a vehicle would nose into view along the outer road, only to vanish again. The ROE briefing played back in her mind without invitation. No fire unless hostile intent was confirmed. No risk to civilians. She had been in enough Overwatch positions to know that the rule was easy to state and harder to live by when seconds decided survival. The crackle of static broke into her earpiece. Just a brief snap before silence returned. She adjusted the volume but knew the problem was deeper than a loose connection. They were already on the edge of reliable communication, and the day had barely begun. Rachel's voice came low, steady, and without turning her head. Sector clear so far. She shifted behind the scope, the fracture catching the first faint light as the sun edged up somewhere behind the haze. Claire could hear her own breathing through the muffled space of her headset, each slow inhale and exhale matching the beat in her chest. That rhythm had guided her through shots in worse places than this. A gust of wind slid through the empty frame of the building, carrying with it a dry whisper of sand. Claire blinked, letting her vision adjust again. She noted the angle of the light, the way it would glare against glass surfaces at certain hours, and how it might betray a target or their own position. She rotated the rifle's bolt just enough to feel its smooth cycle, then locked it back into place. Every motion was a confirmation that when the time came, nothing mechanical would betray her. Below, the compound's gates stayed closed. The street beyond them was quiet except for the slow drift of debris. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Claire made a note of the wind shift in the corner of her range card and returned her eye to the scope. The weight of their task was not in what they could see now, but in what might emerge without warning. This was the patience the job demanded, sitting in a place that reeked of rust and history, eyes fixed on a patch of city that might at any moment decide to turn hostile. She did not speak. She did not move beyond what the rifle required. The city breathed in the distance, and she matched it with her own measured pace, holding to the fragile thread of comms, to the numbers on her card, and to the discipline that had carried her here. The waiting was the work, and for now, the work was all there was. Through the scope, Claire caught the first flicker of movement that didn't belong to the usual morning drift. A convoy was approaching along the narrow access road, its dust plume faint but distinct against the muted skyline. They were early. That alone was enough to make her stomach tighten, though her breathing stayed even. She tracked the lead vehicle, adjusting focus as it rolled into view, counting the shadows in the windows. Rashid Kadir, the man they had been sent to watch for, stepped down from the second truck. He moved with an ease that didn't fit the urgency of the mission, his frame slipping between the hard lines of nearby buildings until, with almost deliberate precision, he vanished into the blind zone. Claire's field of fire ended there. She clicked her transmit and called for the CIA ground lead, but only static came back. The sound was sharp and empty, a small reminder of how fragile their lifeline was. She tried again, changing channels, and got the same hiss. Rooftop, 2 o'clock. Rachel's voice broke in, calm but clipped. Claire shifted her view to catch the outline of a man crouched behind a low wall. The sentry's posture was relaxed, his weapon low. A second figure moved behind him, but both stayed distant enough to be no threat yet. Rachel continued her scan, reporting 2 more positions in the opposite sector, all similarly unconcerned. It was not nothing, but it wasn't enough to act on. The wind picked up, carrying grit that hissed against the jagged window frames around them. Claire saw the sight picture waver as the first breath of the sandstorm arrived. Heat distortion shimmered above the rooftops, bending light in ways her eyes had learned to read, but never quite trust. She shifted her cheek slightly against the stock, recentering the reticle, and noted the change in drift on her dope card. The card was crowded with numbers now, some overwritten, others circled for quick reference, the product of habit and the refusal to rely on memory alone. She returned to scanning the compound's perimeter, searching blind zones for movement. The crosshairs passed over broken alleys, sagging power lines, and narrow balconies where curtains shifted in the growing wind. Somewhere behind those walls, Kadir was either waiting or moving in a direction she could not see. The uncertainty sat in her mind like an itch she could not reach. She could feel her pulse in her throat, each beat heavier than the last, a natural metronome she had used for years to time her shots, now a reminder of how quickly things were tilting. Dust began to settle on her scope's lens. She brushed it away without taking her eye from the glass. The dry taste of it caught in her mouth, making her swallow more often than she wanted. The outlines of the distant rooftop sentries grew hazier, their forms bending in the shifting air, until they seemed less like men and more like mirages. Her mind kept track of their positions anyway, holding the distances and angles in a careful mental map. She glanced once toward Rachel, who was hunched a little deeper behind her own scope, the fracture in its glass catching stray light. Rachel's lips moved, a faint mutter of wind readings or angle corrections meant for her own record. The quiet between them was measured, not empty. Both knew that speaking too much now could mean missing the thing that would matter most. Another sweep of the sector showed nothing but the same restless wind pulling at loose tarps and paper debris. Still, the unease stayed with her. The convoy's early arrival had shifted something fundamental, pulling the mission away from its clean, expected pattern. They were now in the space where information was incomplete, where decisions would come without enough to be sure, and where hesitation could weigh as much as a wrong move. Claire adjusted her scope once more, her hand steady even as the building seemed to lean with the gusts. The sandstorm was coming in slow waves, each one bending the air a little more, a moving veil between her and the ground below. She kept her breathing even, the crosshairs moving in deliberate arcs, waiting for the thing that would force their hand. The city outside seemed to pause with her, holding its secrets for just a moment longer. The first thing Claire noticed was the shape a boxy silhouette moving slowly into her sector from the north, dust curling around its tires. She adjusted focus until the unmarked Toyota Technical filled her scope. The heavy DSHK mounted in the bed looked almost casual in its position, but she knew what it could do to unarmored vehicles in seconds. The truck eased to a stop along the street that served as the compound's primary extraction route. The gunner stood upright, scanning the road with a slow, methodical turn of his head before lowering his hands to the ammunition belt. Rachel's voice cut in, steady but carrying the weight of what they both knew. Per rules of engagement, no shot unless the weapon was fired or aimed directly at the compound. The order hung between them like a lock on the trigger. Claire didn't reply immediately. She measured the angle from the truck's current position to the outer gate, mentally charting the fatal funnel any extraction convoy would have to drive through. She could see the likely path of fire, how the DSHK could sweep it clean before anyone made the turn. The comms hissed and then cracked with a fragment from the ground team, moving soon, before dropping back into silence. She adjusted the volume, knowing it wouldn't help. The sand in the air was working its way into everything. Another gust rattled the loose frame of a nearby window, sending a brief shiver through the wall. Somewhere deep in the building, metal groaned as the structure leaned into the wind. Claire's scope swayed slightly with each gust, forcing her to make constant, fractional corrections. She tracked the gunner's hands as he began feeding the belt into place. The rounds gleamed for a moment before disappearing into the weapon's shadow. She shifted her cheek against the stock, letting the reticle settle back into line. The rooftop sentries she'd noted earlier were now little more than moving shapes in the dust, their outlines blurring until they blended into the haze. Her jaw tightened as she checked the angle again through a gap in the broken wall. The storm was thickening, the air taking on a faint yellow hue as sand and light mixed into a shifting veil. In the back of her mind, the ghost of another mission surfaced, a roadside Overwatch, where she had held fire too long, trusting the rules more than her instincts, only to watch a friendly vehicle torn apart. She remembered the heat on her face from the explosion, the ringing in her ears afterward. She forced her focus back to the present. The Toyota hadn't moved since stopping, but the gunner now rested his hands lightly on the grips. The belt hung loose over the side, swaying slightly in the wind. Every instinct told her to take the shot before the weapon locked into place. But Rachel's earlier reminder sat heavy. A gust slammed into the building, rocking it just enough for dust to cascade from the ceiling. It peppered her cheek and the edge of her rifle, some catching in her earpiece and grinding in her ear when she adjusted it. She ignored the discomfort, keeping her view steady. The earpiece felt like a barrier now. Not a link every call they might need could be swallowed by static before it reached them. She checked her dope card again, noting how much drift she'd need to hold at this range with the wind cutting hard from the east. Her fingers moved lightly along the rifle's body, not pressing the trigger but staying close enough to make the transition without thought. Rachel didn't speak again, but Claire knew she was watching the same target, seeing the same calculation unfold. The silence between them was its own language. The storm roared louder now, wind-driven distortion bending the image in the scope until the edges of the truck seemed to waver. The gunner's face disappeared behind a ripple of heat and dust, then reappeared in sharp relief as the gust shifted. Claire held her position, steady, resisting the pull to act. The moment for firing wasn't yet justified, and yet the weight of inaction pressed just as hard as the weight of the shot itself. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous moments were the ones where nothing happened at all when you watched a threat grow in silence, knowing that the line between safety and disaster could vanish without warning. The glint came from the edge of her vision, just a flicker of light on the far side of the street that didn't match the rhythm of the storm. Claire's breathing paused for half a second before she eased her head down and slid sideways, keeping low. She brought the scope back up at a new angle, scanning for the source. The crack in Rachel's spotting scope caught the pale light at the same time, a brief flash like a signal they hadn't agreed to send. Claire stayed still, adjusting the focus just enough to catch a vague shape prone behind a low wall. It was too far and too distorted by heat and sand to confirm, but the possibility was enough to narrow her chest. Her earpiece crackled as the ground team cut in, the voice clipped by static. Hostage secure, moving to extraction. Claire's eyes never left the rooftop. Somewhere below, the technicals gunner fed the last section of the belt into place, the motion deliberate, unhurried. Down in the street, people began to gather. Most were walking, faces hidden behind scarves, but the movement complicated the line of fire. Civilians in the open meant the rules tightened even more. The narrow window for a justified shot closing before it had really opened. Rachel's voice came over comms. Tighter now, but still even. Hold position. Still within ROE. Claire let the words pass without reply, keeping her cheek pressed to the stock. Her heartbeat filled the space in her ears, a deep, regular thud that matched the faint pulse she felt at her temple. The sensation was almost louder than the storm for a moment. The air shifted suddenly, the gusts falling away into an uncanny stillness. Through the scope, the view sharpened. The technicals gunner was clear, the distant rooftop glint was gone, and the wind was quiet enough that the reticle barely wavered. For 3 breaths, the shot was perfect. Claire's finger found the trigger pad, applying just enough pressure to feel the break point. Then the gusts returned, swirling grit into the air, bending the image until the gunner's outline blurred again. The shot window vanished as quickly as it had come. The sharp tang of dust and ozone pressed at the back of her throat. She blinked to clear the dryness from her eyes, then adjusted to keep the civilians in her peripheral view. Their loose clothing snapped and whipped in the wind, flashes of color against the muted tones of the buildings. The distortion from the storm turned them into moving smears of light and shadow, making every calculation slower, less certain. Rachel shifted beside her, making the smallest of adjustments to her tripod. The fractured lens on her scope refracted a thin beam of light into the wall, a faint tremor of brightness in the otherwise dim corner. Claire's thoughts returned to the distant flash she'd seen earlier. If it was a counter-sniper. They were still out there, watching and waiting, just as she was. That possibility settled over her shoulders like a weight she couldn't shift. She inhaled deeply, the air thick with grit, and exhaled in time with the rhythm in her head. The storm's hiss filled the spaces between those beats, masking other sounds until only the obvious movements registered. Each second stretched, the urgency of the situation pulling against the discipline drilled into her bones. The gunner's posture hadn't changed. The civilians kept drifting into dangerous proximity. And somewhere out there, a potential rifle barrel could be trained in her direction. The gap between a choice and its consequence had narrowed to almost nothing. She knew that if the technical opened fire or the counter-sniper revealed themselves, she would have less than a heartbeat to act. For now, she held, each muscle tuned to the discipline of not firing. Not yet. The longer she waited, the more her mind rehearsed both outcomes, the one where hesitation cost lives, and the one where acting too soon destroyed the mission. Her temple throbbed with the same rhythm as her chest. The cracked glass of Rachel's scope caught another stray glint as they shifted positions again. It was a small thing, but to Claire it felt like a reflection of her own strain, clear enough to work, fractured enough to never be entirely trusted. The storm pressed harder against the walls, dust sifting in through every gap, as if the whole building were breathing with them, waiting for the next move. Rashid Kadir appeared without warning, stepping out from the shadow of a wall into the far side of the courtyard. He moved at a sharp diagonal, angling toward the building that had hidden him since his arrival. Claire's scope picked him up between gaps of broken glass and hanging debris, the image warping with each gust that swept grit across the lens. She didn't move her cheek from the stock, only shifted the reticle until his torso filled the crosshairs. The path ahead of him was lined with fractured windows, one pane in particular throwing back a dull, fractured reflection. The crack across it bent his outline just enough to make her second-guess the true angle. In her head, she ran the math without hesitation distance. wind speed, the arc of the shot through glass and partial cover. She visualized the bullet's path bending fractionally after impact, compensating for what the pain would steal from her velocity. Heat shimmered in the courtyard air, the distortion swimming between her and the target, a living barrier. The heavy truck moved at the same time, its tires grinding against the street as it rolled closer to the extraction route. The gunner adjusted the DSHK, the sound of the mount shifting sharp even through the storm's hiss. Claire could feel time tightening around her, pulling every moving piece into a narrowing frame. Her earpiece erupted with a burst of noise. Then half a sentence from the ground team broke through, taking fire-pinned north wall need route clear before dropping to static again. Rachel's voice followed immediately, her breath audible, clipped by urgency. Negative. Do not engage. Not within ROE. Claire didn't look away. She measured the moment with each slow breath, syncing the rise and fall of her chest with the beat in her ears. Kadir was slipping toward cover that would put him out of reach entirely. The truck was still rolling, bringing its weapon into the perfect line to sweep the gate if the extraction convoy came through. The glass pane hung between her and the man she had come here for, a distortion in the shape of both her target and her decision. Her right hand eased the elevation turret one final click, the faint sound almost lost to the wind. The reticle steadied. She could feel the smooth pad of the trigger against her finger, the exact point before the break, the familiar weight that told her the rifle was ready to speak. Rachel's breathing was still in her ear, tight and fast, though her words were gone now. Claire's own breathing slowed, each inhale deliberate, each exhale a metronome to the thud of her heartbeat. In that narrowing tunnel, the world outside her scope was gone. The storm, the building, the waiting civilians all reduced to background hum. Only the glass, the man, and the gun beyond the truck remained. She knew the cost of this choice would follow her, whether the shot landed or not. On the next exhale, she squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil pushing back into her bones. Through the scope, she saw the pain explode in a spiderweb of fractures, dust and shards drifting into the air. Kadir dropped mid-stride, the impact folding him to the ground before he could reach cover, almost in the same breath. She shifted aim, catching the gunner's movement as he swung the DSHK toward the compound. Another squeeze, another kick of recoil, and the heavy weapon's mount sparked before the gunner collapsed backward into the bed of the truck. The courtyard was a haze of broken glass, heat shimmer, and bodies stilled by force. Claire's breathing came back fast now, her heartbeat still loud in her ears but steady. She eased the rifle's bolt open, the spent casing bouncing once on the cracked floor beside her. Rachel exhaled sharply into comms, the sound almost like she'd been holding her own breath the whole time. Claire stayed behind the rifle a moment longer, eyes sweeping the courtyard for movement, the cracked glass now only another piece of the scene. The decision was made, the cost accepted. The courtyard below was already dissolving into the storm when Claire eased her finger from the trigger. The shapes of the fallen blurred in the thickened air, the technical half swallowed by dust. The impact of both shots had been sharp and contained, but now the muffled boom of their echoes lingered oddly in the choking atmosphere. Static filled her ear until a voice from command cut through, clipped and uncertain, asking for status clarification. Claire didn't answer. The ground team's movement was visible only as brief silhouettes before the wall of grit took them. The storm hit in full, the wind pushing hard against the side of the building. Sand lashed at her face and found the gap between glove and sleeve. She pulled back from the firing position, already slinging the rifle in close against her body. Rachel was moving without a word, collapsing the tripod and tucking it under one arm. They fell into step without discussion, crossing the open floor to the stairwell. Glass shifted and crunched under their boots, sharp little sounds beneath the roar outside. Inside the stairwell, the air was dim and heavy, the storm's light filtering in only through broken slits in the wall. The echo of their boots on the concrete was hollow, the sound stacking on itself in the narrow space. Each step down felt louder than it should, but there was no other way out. Sand had found its way in here too, grit grinding between Claire's gloves and the textured stock of her rifle. Halfway down, a single distant shot cracked through the storm, thin but unmistakable. Then another. Claire and Rachel exchanged the quickest glance, both adjusting their pace without speaking, dropping lower and keeping to the building's inner wall. The possibility of a counter-sniper was real enough to warrant urgency without panic. They moved through the next landing in perfect tandem, Rachel peeling left to check the hall before Claire stepped through. The rooms they passed were hollow shells, wind whistling faintly through the gaps where windows had once been. Each doorway offered a thin slice of the storm's chaos, outside sand hammering the world into a uniform blur. The radio on Claire's chest hissed again with the same unanswered query from command, the words half lost in the static. She tapped it off without looking down. Recognition would come later, if at all. Right now, only movement mattered. By the time they reached the ground floor, visibility beyond the doorway had collapsed to mere meters. The sandstorm pressed like a wall, erasing everything beyond arm's reach. Claire tightened her grip on the rifle, the weight of it a steady anchor as they stepped into the wind. Survival had become the mission. The extraction was quick, silent, and without ceremony. Claire and Rachel were moved with the rest of the team, bundled into the back of a covered vehicle that rattled over uneven streets. No one spoke. The hum of the engine filled the space between them. A sound that was steady, but without comfort. The official word from command was already filtering through in clipped transmissions. Objectives met. Casualties minimal. But when the action reports began to form, Claire's role was marked only as unconfirmed. It was not unexpected. The safe house was a low, concrete building with narrow rooms and windows left cracked from years of neglect. Vehicles idled outside, their low growl seeping through the walls. Inside, the air was still, holding the faint scent of oil, metal, and the grit that had followed them in from the storm. Claire sat at a small table with her rifle laid out in front of her. The cleaning rod slid through the barrel in smooth, rhythmic passes, each movement matching the slow, even pace of her heartbeat. Across from her, Rachel had shed her helmet, setting it on the floor beside her boots. She leaned forward slightly, forearms on her knees, watching without intruding. The cracked spotting scope sat on the bench next to her, untouched, still bearing the flaw that had marked the mission from the first hour. She didn't mention the ROE, didn't revisit the decision, but her eyes carried the weight of shared understanding. No words were needed. A thin beam of pale light pushed through the broken window, catching the fine dust that drifted through the air. Each mote turned lazily, suspended in the stillness, as if the outside world had slowed to match the quiet inside. The faint rasp of the cloth against metal filled the room, the oil spreading in a thin sheen under Claire's deliberate touch. Her hands moved without rush, the process as ingrained as breathing. From outside came the muted shuffle of boots on gravel and the occasional muffled order, the city resuming its hum without acknowledging what had passed. The sand still moved through the streets, curling into corners, settling on rooftops, erasing footprints before they could be noticed. Claire reassembled the rifle with the same care she had taken in the field. When she was finished, she laid it across her lap and let her hands rest on the stock, feeling the familiar weight. The mission was over, the decisions made and carried out. Whether anyone outside this room ever knew the exact moment that had turned the tide didn't matter now. The work was done, the lives saved, and the record would say otherwise. That was the nature of the job. She met Rachel's gaze once more, a silent exchange that held all the acknowledgement either of them needed.